This year's theme overlay provided an opportunity for me to carefully curate and edit my work, to look at the linkages between the various roles and hats that I wear. One as an educator, as an assistant professor at Cornell in architecture, the other as a principal investigator where I direct my own lab and collaborate with material scientists, cell biologists, physicists, etc. And then also as an experimental architectural designer in the context of Sabin Studio. So overlay for me was defined as an active datascape, sort of looking at the datascapes, whether they be stemming from biology, cellular biology, or mathematical models, and looking at how that specifies and steers the projects that you see here up on the wall. And I elected to feature 3 projects that are, all of them have been developed at Sabin Studio in the last 4 years. And for me, in the way that I work, there are kind of 3 phases that all of the research and applied projects follow. And a lot of that has to do with the productive management of scale. And so oftentimes we start with the development of new tools, methods that then move into architectural prototyping and the constraints of making and issues of craft, which are very much present in all of these projects. And then some of those prototypes are brought into the realm of building and looking at issues of ecological building design. And so all of these projects, I would say, really occupy that mid-scale as experimental structures that are moving into applications at a building scale. What I think are some of the most mature experiments that have been influenced by what we're doing in the Sabin Design Lab at Cornell, but are very much answering to the constraints that are inherent to fabrication and architecture. So I've been obsessed with weaving for many, many years, and the inspiration for the layout draws upon those interests. And so what you see here are a series of linear bands that have connections horizontally, but also draw connections vertically, taking cues from warp and weft as an active matrix, where it's not about a singular project per se, but drawing linkages across all 3. Part of that has to do with looking at the historical linkages between weaving and architecture, specifically looking at what was going on in the weaving workshops at the Bauhaus and some of the early models by them that linked computation and that which is inherent to the production of weavings that combine warp and weft, where the control of information and flow of pattern is inextricably linked with its geometry and its materiality. And one might even say that the women that were active in the weaving workshops provided some of the first examples, albeit analog, of parametric design. At the end of the day, I'm happiest as a maker. In addition to my background in architecture, I also have a BFA in ceramics and interdisciplinary visual arts. And so I'm very interested in how these issues stemming from the sciences, investigated through sophisticated digital techniques, are then wedded with issues of making and craft, and how those constraints actually productively contaminate the process and bring it into the realm of architecture. And so in all of the projects, never is there a point where the design is post-rationalized into a material structure, because at every phase of the design process, there's an interest in embedding material constraints and issues of making and fabricating along the way. That also harkens back to some of my interests in matrix biology, which early on, one of my longtime collaborators, Dr. Peter Lloyd Jones, who had been looking at some very specific diseases particular to the lung. And so we were looking at data sets that were produced in his lab, but essentially we were looking at endothelial cells that form the vascular lining of the lung, and how changes in environment in turn create changes in the overall networking behavior of the cell as it clusters and then forms surfaces and forms volumes. And that provides a really powerful ecological model for looking at how an active environment, the extracellular matrix, then influences the production of form and structure, compliance, etc. One might even look at it as a kind of metaphor for the loom. So that interest in looking at how geometry and materia are actively engaged really drives all of the work here. And the myThread Pavilion, which was a commission that came to me from Nike, looked back to a number of years of investigation into textile processes and collaboration with textile designers. And the early part of the project actually demanded that I collaborate with a textile designer, her name's Anne Emling, so that I could learn the fundamentals of knitting. Because on the one hand, while I knew a lot about weaving, I didn't know a whole lot about knitting. And so we worked together to understand which parameters we could extract and then move into much larger scales. It's looking at the possibility of fabric architectures scaling up, looking at linkages between the sensitivity and flexibility of the human body as a starting point, and how that can then inform the structure inherent to knitting, right, and its performance and flexibility. And so the knitting in the myThread Pavilion project was all done digitally. We invested a lot of time working directly with Shimoseki, who are at the cutting edge of what's known as whole garment knitting. So you can actually, with their machines, knit three-dimensional seamless elements. And so the myThread Pavilion is composed of hundreds of cones, knitted cones at various scales. What started out as a very sophisticated set of digital investigations, simulations, visualizations, then became about how do we interface their machines. I wasn't interested in just necessarily handing files over to them, but actually understanding how we could interface with their CAD/CAM technology. In 2006, I co-founded Lab Studio with Dr. Peter Lloyd-Jones with an interest in pairing graduate architecture students with postdocs in the context of the lab setting. And that started at Penn and now has matured into my own lab, which is based at Cornell. I would say probably the most important thing that came out of Lab Studio was the production of a new model for collaboration, a kind of conceptual space for exchange. I think Lab Studio is being seen by many people around the world as perhaps, we think, maybe the first model where there was direct collaboration between cell biologists, matrix biologists, Peter, his team, and myself and my graduate research associates. It was very important to Peter and I early on that we would have deliverables on both sides of the fence, so to speak, both in biomedicine and also in architecture. But it was also extremely important to provide a framework for communicating. And so before we actually formalized the research, which then led into securing National Science Foundation grants, etc., we actually spent a year learning how to communicate. And he would attend my studio reviews, I attended his weekly lab meetings, and we quickly learned that while we shared many like terms, we had very different definitions for those terms. And so I think that investment of time in that first year was incredibly important and continues to be formative in all of my collaborations. So it wasn't necessarily all of the work that was produced, but really a kind of way of thinking and a way of engaging process across scales.